I'm Nye McGee with EURweb.com. Thank you for giving me your time today to speak about this very exciting Free for All, the Public Library documentary, which is going to be debuting here on April 29th, PBS's Independent Lens. And I had the opportunity to watch it this morning as I was getting prepared for this interview and loved this piece. You visited over 100 libraries across the country during your childhood, right? How did those early experiences, visiting these libraries shape your understanding of libraries as community hubs? And how does that passion come through in this documentary?
That's a good and hard question there you're starting out with. You know what I think my childhood experiences especially instilled in me is beyond the very obvious, which is a love of libraries and a love of reading, is an understanding how each one is so different and they just really reflect their own communities. Like there's 17, almost 17,000 libraries in this country, and each one is different. And it really depends on what the community wants it to be. And that really struck me everywhere we went.
Obviously, this documentary dives into the revolutionary spirit behind the public library system. So, what inspired you? What initially drew you to tell this story?
We started it over 10 years ago, and it was sort of as the country was coming out of the recession, and a lot of people were saying to me, we don't need libraries anymore. We have the internet, you don't need anything like that. Paper books are on their way out. And that wasn't meshing at all with my experience of going to the library, which is that at that time they were at their all-time high usage because so many people who were out of work or looking for job transitions or, needed childcare. Uh, the libraries were packed, the ones that I was visiting. And I was really also getting freaked out about how fragile our whole public world was starting to seem. It was like public schools were under siege, our jails were being privatized. Everything seemed like it was being privatized to me for a little while there. And that certainly hasn't stopped. But would say that was the main impetus, was just really kind of wanting to understand why there was this disconnect between what I was hearing out in the world and what I was seeing happening inside libraries themselves.
And so, this documentary obviously touches on both the inspiring and uncomfortable histories of public libraries. So, how did you kind of balance celebrating their impact while confronting this exclusionary past?
That's what history's about, isn't it? It's about telling the whole story, not just the shiny positive part of the story. And to me, that's what makes this story so beautiful. Is like it is this tale of living up to our American ideals, which went unrealized in many ways for many people for such a long time. But, gradually the library went from a place in the United States that was only for adult and primarily adult white men to a place that welcomed women. The children weren't even allowed in public libraries when they first started opening, and certainly not people of color, and especially not people of color in the Deep South. Or, the thing that surprised me the most was learning that the very first people to inhabit this land were the very last to get library access. So libraries didn't arrive out on tribal reservations until like the 70s, mid 70s. Um, and that's something we take for granted, or at least I've taken for granted all my life, and I think probably your generation too. But it's something we can't take for granted anymore.
Absolutely. And of course, we see so many personal stories unpacked in this documentary, like Annie Lou McPeter's story, and she had a very, her connection to a young Martin Luther King Jr., was a powerful moment. What was it like for you uncovering these personal stories like hers during the making of this documentary?
When I heard her voice coming across on this old tape, I almost fell out of my chair because I was like, wow, A, I've never heard of her. B, I've never heard this story. And C, it just went on and on and on. We only got to use a small piece of it in the film, but she goes on to talk about how Martin Luther King wanted to, she had a small collection of books about nonviolence and Mahatma Gandhi. And he really wanted to read those books, but they were only in the adult section. And so he wasn't allowed to read them. And he kept insisting. And so finally, she got him to bring his dad in to check out the books for him on the adult library card. And she had just a ton of stories like that that I found fascinating.
And you highlight librarians as quiet revolutionaries. Can you speak on how today's librarians are continuing that legacy, especially in an era, where an era of book bans and political pressure?
Good question. Um, I think librarians have traditionally been seen as sort of one of the highly respected pillars of their communities, kind of like school teachers. And we think of them as nonpartisan and non-controversial most of the time because they're there to help us find information. But when we remember that the idea that like having access to information that's free and unrestricted is not um, it is a revolutionary idea. Just the idea itself is revolutionary. And so upholding it when you've got people opposing that takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of flack. They're taking a lot of flack right now, you know. I think it's hard for librarians to go from being, looked up to and respected to being accused of being groomers and pedophiles and all kinds of crazy things that are happening right now. Part of it is we want to thank librarians, and give them a little bit of moral support out there and let them know how many Americans love and appreciate what they do.
So, on that note, how do you envision the future of public libraries in America?
Mm. I'm not a historian and I'm not a fortune teller. I'm just a filmmaker. And the one thing I learned on this film is that it's up to us. You know, it's not the anonymous government that decides what happens to our libraries. Libraries are public places, which means they belong to us. We pay for them. We decide if we want to pay for them. We decide what we want in them. And we decide if we want to pass this really remarkable American institution on to future generations or not.
Libraries weren't always inclusive. So, I want to unpack that a little bit more. Why was it important for you to include stories of marginalized groups who fought for access and representation?
Well, I'm the daughter of a historian, a Deep South historian who specialized in Reconstruction, which was, I don't know how familiar you are with that chapter of history, but that's the period that came after the Civil War when some really radical experimental ideas about including people who had been left out before the war were being included in the American vision. And it was dismantled like that. And we've forgotten it. And we went from that to like deep, deep Jim Crow segregation for a long time where I was from. And we didn't learn that history in school. I learned it because my dad was teaching it at the university level, but that was sort of a pioneering thing he was doing, and we certainly didn't learn it in public school. We learned that the North was bad, and that they were all carpetbaggers who came down to destroy the Southern way of life, and you know what that story is. Uh, and I think we're at another moment in history where there are forces that want to rewrite our history and leave out an awful lot. And so it was really important to me not to have that happen in this film, and to make sure that I emphasize also because I think it's amazing how much the people who were left out actually pushed forward and shaped the public library as an institution. They changed it, and to the benefit of all of us. For me personally, it was discovering how many generations of my own family's lives have been shaped by the public library. Starting with my great grandmother, who was an immigrant from Norway, whose kids didn't have access to any books out on the farm, to my, on the other side of my family, which is much more urban, sort of the immigrant neighborhood experience and how vital that was to just my aunts and my uncles and my my parents themselves in terms of getting an education and uh, kind of living the American dream.
Right on. What do you hope audiences take away about the role of public libraries in our democracy today?
I hope that people, one of our characters says this really well. I hope that people realize what a gift these places are and how fragile they are. You know, we think that these are things that are part of the American, our birthright or something, but the only reason they're here is because people fought for them, and they're very, very fragile, and it's up to us to make sure they stay.